So who here is completely tired of this question already? Because when I was pitched this topic, I was like, well, everyone's already talked about this for ages. Today, I'm not going to try and convince you of a particular yes or no to this question. Today, I'll actually try and paint a framework so that you can actually think about this question yourself. And even if you're not a designer, hopefully this framework and sort of the history and sort of the background that I'll be talking about in the next 10, 15 minutes will give you a better idea for where I think this question is going to go, not just today, but in the future. So I'm actually going to talk about this through the lens of time and actually use history, actually use sort of like how technology has progressed to sort of approach this question, because this question is probably the most circumstantial question out there, and it's also probably the most debated, and there isn't a clear right or wrong. So I'm going to use the lens of time to sort of guide this conversation, and I'll hopefully show you guys along the way how at least I'm thinking about it. So we're going to start in the past. So let's go way, way, way back. This is a mainframe, and it's effectively designers 40 years ago, they were the programmers. They were designing their code to trying to fit it on a punch card. They're designing their code to get it to run efficiently. We're talking about 1 kilobyte. We're talking about 2 kilobytes here. So effectively, the designers and the developers were the same thing. And technology didn't progress to a point where you could actually build a UI. So 30 years ago, we finally had UIs. We finally had the ability to turn code into a user interface. And that's when we started seeing the separation between a designer and developer. And fast forward another 10 years, we have Web 1.0, we have things like Google, we have websites. So now for the very first time, we started seeing this specialization between product design and product development, because the two are very different, but equally difficult. If you look at this web page, there's a lot of things that are going on here. There's navigation, there's user experience, there's visual design with the Google logo. And all of these things have to play together in concert, and then now the developer has to figure out how to go and implement it. So now let's fast forward again, and let's look at where we are today, at least on the web. And today, while we're on the web, we're seeing things like animations and interactions. And the products that we're using to design can't necessarily capture things like this very well. Another thing that's quite a big topic is how fluid the layouts are now nowadays. So this is an example of something that you can do in CSS. And look at how like the words are breaking in accordance to the width of the screen. And these are things that designers now have to account for. You have to actually figure out, okay, how is my layout going to look at this particular screen width, at this particular dots per inch? You have to think about these things as a designer now. On top of that, websites nowadays are driven by dynamic data. And at a certain point, you're also going to think about user-generated content. So designers now also have to think about all the different data sources that power their products, and they also have to think about the restraints that their products have to live in. For example, right here, you have a listing for an Airbnb post, and as a product designer at Airbnb, you actually now have to think, okay, I have 120 characters that I want to fit within this particular box on this page. What's going to happen if this Airbnb host writes all W's, like the maximum width, right? What's going to happen to that design? And these are the things that now designers have to grapple with. Not only that, we're talking about building for literally hundreds of different screen dimensions. You're thinking about, okay, how does this look on an iPhone? How does this look on an Android? And the tools that designers use today are things like Photoshop, Sketch, Figma. Very new tools, super slick. I recommend you guys check it out. But these are all tools that have essentially static design tools like pens and vectors, and they don't necessarily think about the medium that these designers have to build for. And in this case, what I'm talking about here is the web. What I'm talking about here are mobile apps. And the medium that we're building for has the elements of responsive design, data-driven design, and things like that. So what happens today right now is that a designer goes in and mocks up something in Photoshop, designs something incredibly beautiful, and then goes in and hands it over to the developer, where the developer now has to code it up in HTML, JavaScript. Oh, and by the way, there's also a million other things that the developer has to do now. And here, let's center back to sort of the question, should designers learn to code? But we actually have to look at this one really critical piece about the spectrum between design and development, and that's the handoff. So who's familiar with this process? Who here's a designer that's designed something, he's like, now I have to hand it off, yeah. And a lot of things get lost in translation, I'm sure, right? And you're thinking, what the heck happened to my design? These pixels are all off. You're thinking, what about this particular screen size? What's gonna happen when it's a retina display? And then the developer's asking, he's like, what did you mean by this particular interaction? What did you mean by this animation when you click here? What is this supposed to actually do? And this handoff makes things very difficult. And that's why today, I bite my tongue when I say that designers nowadays have to at least understand the constraints of code, understand the power of code, in order to be an effective designer. And it's for these reasons. So responsive design, I touched on this already, but you're now looking at devices that are of varying sort of widths. You have the fluid nature of the web, the fluid nature of the mobile, and you have to, as a designer, actually have to use breakpoints. You actually have to think about the technology underneath your design to figure out how the design is going to behave under these circumstances. And for those that may not be familiar with this term, responsive design is essentially designing with multiple different devices in mind. Another big reason why designers should at least learn the sort of power of code today is interaction design. Right now, if you're designing for a website, if you're designing for a mobile app, you could try and mock something up in Framer or Origami or pick your interaction design tool. But now that developer actually has to rebuild that interaction that you as a designer created in the code. But from what I've seen, it's the best designers that are out there are actually building these designs themselves in Xcode using HTML5 and JavaScript. Another sort of reason here is the data-driven design, the taking into account user-generated content. What happens when a user puts in 120 W's into a form and completely blows up the layout of a page? And using data to power your design process is, in my opinion, today a very critical part of design. So let's take a look at actually what design is. And in my opinion, design is how it works. You as a designer, your sole responsibility is to make the best possible product. And if people can't figure out how your product works, then you've failed at it as a designer. So that's why today, because of the restraints that you have and because of this gap with this tooling, because you're designing in static mockups and then entrusting that a developer is going to take it all away for you, that's why today I think designers should learn code. And then let's face it, design is a profession. And the people that are hiring designers nowadays are also looking at your ability to bridge that handoff gap. So that's biting my tongue when I say that. Designers should learn how to code today. But I just want to use the last few minutes of my time to actually have us peer into the future and to actually kind of open this up a little bit more, to actually think about what that future could look like. And for this, I go back to this design and development spectrum again. And for me, I don't believe in the future we're going to be talking about a handoff. To me, I believe designers of the future will be empowered to create products, maybe even all the way. And the implementation of the front end is going to still be important and still going to be important for engineers to exist. But the ability for designers to be able to actually create for that medium directly, I think absolutely has to happen, and in my opinion, has already been done before. It's been done in 3D animation. It's been done in cinematic grading. All these disciplines where developers have built tools to help designers build for the medium that they're creating in. When you're going into Unity today, and if you're designing a game, you'll actually see all the different UI controls that will allow you to create an environment like this, which previously was only possible with code. Same thing with music production, same thing with all these other disciplines out there where designers have been empowered with creating for the medium directly. And the last speaker was talking about Iron Man. And to me, it's very difficult to picture a future where Tony Stark is whipping up Sublime Text and programming his next UI in HTML and CSS. And for me, I don't think necessarily that future or that vision of the future for technology is very exciting to me. And if we look at web designers today, they're still doing this. They're still designing responsively in code. They're still designing interactions in code. And they're trying to plug in data-driven designs into their process. To me, I think this is living in the past. So what I sort of see as a vision for the future is a world where designers are empowered to create with the power of code underneath the hood, and that there would be visual abstractions that would empower the designers to create a website that works just as well, that uses semantic code, that they can build and publish all in a UI. And a lot of you are thinking, like, oh, this could be just another Dreamweaver or whatever. But in my opinion, this world is already the sort of direction, this is the movement that I believe the future is going to look like, where a world where designers are empowered to do these things themselves. So today, designers should learn code. Tomorrow, I'm not too convinced. I think that our ability to innovate, our ability to use technologies to empower creatives, it's only just begun. So thank you. Maybe questions or?
So maybe we have some questions in the audience. Maybe you could raise your hand who has a question. There are no questions? There is a question. You.
In that, so front-end developers to me play a really important role because they're filling in the sort of the last mile, and to really be able to connect with the back end, to really be able to connect with external data sources, to bring the product to life. And to, at least for me, the immediate future looks like a visual coder, essentially, or a visual developer is able to take that UI and solve the biggest sort of gaps in design and development today, which are responsive, data-driven, interactions, usability, prototyping. And these are the things that I feel like designers are struggling to break through right now because they don't have the power of code to actually allow them to do so.